Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor, turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below. And I would appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it's released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and any issues related to those issues. A hearty shout out to the Rabyd Nation. Join the nation by hitting that subscribe button. And if you want to be a paying citizen of the nation and support the channel in a more tangible way, hit the join button and your options will be presented to you. Today I want to talk a little bit about deconversion. In particular, I want to give you 5 ways that you can lose the slave mentality of religion. But I kind of have to define what I'm talking about. The impetus for this thought came a few days ago when I was in a live chat discussion, and I was watching one, and then in the aftermath I saw some comments, and one of the comments by one of the Christians was, you either are a slave to sin or you're going to be a slave to Christ. And I realized how much of a slave mentality that is, that the only 2 options that are presented to the Christian are this idea of slave to sin or slave to Christ. Paul is largely responsible for this in Romans, but if you read Romans, it really is about, accepting salvation by accepting slavery to Jesus, basically, and then Jesus frees you somehow. It's this kind of freedom through slavery mentality that a lot of religions have, and it's very dangerous because, we have to, watch this notion, because I think what religion ultimately does, particularly religions that have a high submission to the religion mentality, cults, things like that, is you get this idea of submission to authority, and it's an abject, absolute submission to authority. And it even reflects in their afterlife. For instance, in the case of Christianity, heaven is basically a place where God rules everything and everybody is just submitted to God. It's really a kind of weird notion that we're all going to find freedom and joy and bliss through submission. And it's always noticed after death, okay? One of the ways that religion uses this slave mentality is to keep people submitted to the religion, but also religion often works hand in hand with political systems and helps people keep submitted to the government. As somebody who's more of a libertarian political philosophy, I see the 2 sides of the same coin kind of thing, and don't think your political party is some sort of exception to this. Politics has always used religion, and religion has always benefited from politics in those situations. It's why I took up political science as well as biblical studies, because I began to realize the correlation between the 2. And you have to kind of get out of this slave mentality, because these groups use this slave mentality to manipulate you, and they often invoke emotion to get you change and do other things. And so what you have to realize is that you have this slave mentality. Now, I want to give an example of this, because you're either a slave to sin or a slave to Christ. Notice that you are not given an option of freedom. You have only slavery as an option. You're going to be a slave to one or another. Now, really, I feel this is a false dichotomy. There's a lot of other choices out there. For instance, you could be free. Okay, you're not a slave to anything. That slavery as a mental concept is completely wrong. That any human being being owned by another human being or entity is a bad idea and an evil moral idea. Okay, and you can come to those conclusions without any kind of necessity of slave to anything. But it's this mentality that keeps a person always with their head bowed, okay, always doing something that the entity wants them to do, rather than what is best for themselves. Okay, it's an absolute idea of monarchy, where something is overriding you. Now, in this particular case, as an atheist, God doesn't exist. Jesus isn't the Son of God. God doesn't give commands. Jesus doesn't give commands. So there's no commands to violate and become sin. Slavery, sin is never really your master. You're just a human being, okay, with human desires, okay? Can those desires get off the rails? Sure. But we would all recognize that regardless of whether there's a deity or not. Okay, and so we don't need all of that. We don't need a submission to any kind of authority necessarily to realize the goodness of society. Even submission to the government should always be questioned, okay, because why are you doing it, and is this a good action? I've lost count of the times I've read in history where people did evil things because of I was just doing what I was told. A true person that gets past this slavery mentality would never use that as an excuse. I was just doing what I was told. You should be doing something because it's morally right, regardless of who tells you what to do it. Okay, and that's probably the number one thing about getting over this slavery mentality. Make sure you're doing it out of your own personal freedom, not because somebody else told you to do it. Okay, assess whether the idea is a good one and go forward with that. Okay, you have to remember to accept responsibility for your actions. That's the first tip I'm going to give you. One of the great side dodges of religion, particularly my ex-religion, Christianity, is, well, you can just go to God, and if you're submitted to Him, then He can forgive you of any trespass. So it doesn't matter. One of the great parables that Jesus tells is, the slave that, gets forgiven by his master, but then goes out and beats his other slave because that slave owed him something. And then he visits the punishment back upon himself because he didn't forgive other people. This kind of leads to the idea that if I just get forgiveness from God, sure, I have to forgive my fellow man, but at the same time, I don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to forgive me. They have to forgive me now because God has forgiven me. And I think it's this mentality that people love about the slave mentality, because they can just go to God, get on their knees and ask for forgiveness, and then they don't have to take responsibility for their actions. Now, that's not in all cases, but on a practical level, I saw it in the church all the time, where people would come in, well, I did this person wrong, and I know it was wrong, but I'm just going to ask God for forgiveness, and it'll be okay. They didn't have any sense of going to make restitution or anything like that, or taking responsibility for their actions. Ultimately, the idea of getting forgiveness for sins is not taking responsibility for your actions, but instead letting God basically wash away the consequences. In order to be a true free person, you have to accept personal responsibility for your actions. That's the first thing to do in getting over a slave mentality. Okay, number two, that you have to recognize that this kind of submission is the bedrock of abusive relationships. Okay, I lost track of the number of husbands and wives that I saw in the ministry. Don't know how many where the whole wife has to submit to the husband was the basis for a very abusive relationship. And the woman was definitely very abused, and the man was equally a victim of it because he felt he had to be in charge and that he had to always tell his wife what to do. This is kind of one of those bases of a submissive, bad relationship. But it's also the bad idea of clergy being in, I'm the authority of my church, I'm the anointed one or whatever, and all of a sudden you feel like you have this religious power that allows you to basically do anything to your congregants you want. I had to guard against this all the time, and often found myself disliking any philosophy of church leadership that had this kind of moral issue of, oh, I get to tell people what to do. No, not really. Okay, if you're going to respect people's freedom, you have to get over the idea that this is a good thing. This is the basis for abusive relationships. Number three, you have to accept the responsibility to the point of developing your own thoughts on morality and action. Developing your own moral philosophy becomes the bedrock of your own personal freedom. Okay, it doesn't mean you can't go out there and look at things that you like or enjoy. But it also means that, if you're going to take in something as part of your moral philosophy, it has to be your choice. It shouldn't be something that you submit to because the authority tells you to submit to it. It should be something that you embrace because it's going to help you walk in your freedom better and going to make you into a better human being. I'm probably going to give a lot of examples of this on Friday when I talk about my own personal struggles with getting back into virtue, but I can reveal here that I began to realize that there was one common element of all religions and moral philosophy, and that was the pursuit of virtue. There's a pretty good common element that human virtue is a good thing, regardless of who preaches it or talks about it. And so that became the basis of a lot of my own personal search for my own moral philosophy, was how do I act in human virtue. Okay, but this was not imposed on me. I embraced it. I took it. Wow, that's a cool idea. That's a great idea. Let's bring that in and make that help. Make that a part of who I am. The next one is explore your freedom and respect the freedom of others. There's a lot to be said that once you deconvert, I know the accusation for Christians is, oh, you just wanted to be free of Christianity, so go and sin. Well, you turn around and say, I don't believe sin in the biblical sense exists, so no, that's not what this is about. There's a lot of things that are just simply human and morally neutral that religions like to make bad for some reason, okay? And so exploring some of those in your own recognizance is okay. But the other thing is respecting the freedom of others. Getting over the self-righteous attitude of pointing your finger at somebody and saying, that's morally wrong, without really any good moral basis for it, but other than your book or your religion says so, that changes the way you think about the actions of others. It's amazing that after I deconverted from Christianity, how little reason I had to hate other people. All of a sudden, I didn't have any reason to point my moral finger at somebody else. In fact, I suddenly realized that the only real morality that I could be responsible for ultimately was my own. And that's really the freedom of being your own master, which is another point I'll make here in a minute. But the simple idea of letting others be free to be who they are and being free yourself to be who you want to be. Now, you have to respect the freedom of others. I think when we look at liberty, it's something that we take upon ourselves, but it's also something we give back to others. If you really want the virtue of freedom to roll through your life, you really have to allow for others to be free. All of a sudden, as I can give as a good example, LGBTQ people weren't evil to me anymore. That was part of their personal responsibility and choices. And as long as they weren't harming me, what did I care? I began to look at morality and as more utilitarian as a social species and go, hey, it benefits me because I'm not spending all my emotional energy being a moral judge of something that I can't control. And on the other hand, this person is free to explore their own sexuality and their own sexual desires and figure them out. As long as they're not harming anybody else, what do I care? As long as it's consensual, what do I care? Slowly but surely, this moral judgment lifts off your shoulders when you realize you don't have to be submitted to some moral code that somebody else imposed on everybody else. Getting rid of that, exploring and respecting the others and the freedom of others. And fifth and lastly, learn to be your own master. I know that kind of takes on the submission language, but you need to realize that there's nobody with their leash around your neck anymore. And learning to either take that leash into your own mouth and say, okay, I'm responsible for myself, and learn to make your choices based on what is beneficial to you and to the people around you that you love and care for, is a very different way of looking at things. A lot of times religion says that that's what they're doing, but when you look at it, sometimes people break off relationships with family members over nothing more than religious ideology. To me, that's stupid. Okay, it's just straight up stupid. I watched a number of couples that were great couples. They would have been great for each other. They were, well, they meshed well, but one of them was a Christian, the other one wasn't. And so all of a sudden the Christian was, well, I can't marry this guy or I can't marry this girl because, we don't have compatible religions. And I realize that can be a problem, but it's the slave mentality that says that I can't be unequally yoked with unbelievers that's a problem. Okay, and learning to be your own master means, hey, you know what? I can make this choice because there's other factors to consider, whether or not this is a good choice or not. And learning to be your own master is, I don't need to have this submission thing. And I know this is a hard thing for a lot of us that are deconverting. We've had these commandments drummed into our heads since we were little kids. We've been told through preachers all of our lives that you have to submit to the Bible, you have to submit to God. I'm sure in Islam it's very, very similar. Submit to the Torah, submit to the religious leaders, on and on the list goes. It's a rare person that can suddenly realize, I don't have to submit to anybody. Okay, if I submit to anything, it's because I should choose to do so, not because somebody else forced me to do it. And this is a hard mentality to get into. And this is just some of my advice. I'm no expert on this, but I know some of the things that I've had to pull away from. Now, I've been a libertarian politically all my life, but realizing that libertarian philosophy also pulled me out of religion is kind of one of the things. But I also recognize there's a religiosity to politics and government and all the other authorities that are out there. It doesn't mean I don't submit to those things if it's to my benefit. And I also realize that some people have more power than I do. But it doesn't change the fact that I'm doing it for my own benefit. I'm doing it to be my own master, to follow my own moral code. And I think I've developed a better moral code than the one that the religion gave me because of it. Doing the hard work, realizing that asking others to submit to you and submitting to other people is the basis of abuse, and just getting rid of all of that, respecting your own freedom, respecting the freedom of others, and just going out there and exploring your own who yourself is and who you are in relationship to other people in your own personal freedom is one of the greatest joys of living to me now. Learning how to deal with that, and it's just opened up a whole multitude of possibilities for me. And a lot of people, well, you atheists must not have a lot of hope. Actually, I have more hope than I've ever had before because I recognize reality. And once you recognize reality and get under this yoke of this slave mentality of religion, then you begin to realize that you can go forward in a lot of life with a lot more joy and a lot more enjoyment, simply accepting your own humanity and your own freedom and taking responsibility for it. Well, thank you for stopping by. I appreciate every like, share, and subscribe. The channel continues to grow. We recently broke 3,800 watch hours. We're getting very, very close to that ad revenue. Keep watching the videos. Keep enjoying it. Your support of the channel does this old preacher turned atheist his heart really good. Thank you very, very much. And as always, remember to live your best life. Pursue your own life and your own freedom, using all your time, your talent, your resources to benefit yourself, others around you that you love and care for in the world that we live in. And don't waste it on the trappings of religion and faith. That just leads to slavery, and it's not a good thing. Trust me, I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.